the button. It says you're live. I always like to wait a few seconds because I don't trust that I'm actually live when it says live. But this is the Disciples of Yahweh in Christ, and we're having a live stream today with Michael Jones from Inspiring Philosophy. So great to have our guest speaker. Thank you for coming, and everyone who shows up and or watches the replay. Michael, is so great when someone like you has a big channel comes to our little channel. We always get a boost. So we really appreciate you being here. Welcome.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right,
And
so we are the Disciples of Yahweh in Christ. That's our channel. Please like and subscribe. If you're watching the stream, give us some thumbs up. That helps the stream get out there. And today we're going to talk about new atheism. Whatever happened to the new atheism? Remember the four horsemen and how atheism was going to take over the world? And, after 9/11, there was a lot of talk about how religion poisons everything. What happened
hmm
to that movement? That's our topic for today. But let's say hello to Brother Jody. Jody, how you doing?
oh, I am blessed with the joy of Yahweh, Elohim, Jesus Christ, and Holy Spirit. And I am glad to finally be live. We used to do this a lot more frequently, but we've been slacking off on that department. But we have been producing videos, just not live videos. So
hmm
please join us, share our videos, subscribe, and go and check Michael Jones' channel out as well. He's got a lot of really great videos, especially on the topic we're covering today, atheism. So
Yeah.
he's a phenomenal debater. I wouldn't want to be on the other side of the debate with him, actually. But he debated Michael Rowe. That's where I really, or Rowe. That's where I actually got from. Am I saying that right?
Wait,
Mike
Mike Rowe is the guy from Dirty
Mike Rowe.
Jobs. Mike
Okay,
Ruse is the
Mike
atheist.
Bruce. Oh Lord. All right.
I don't
Sorry
think
about this. Sorry
I don't
about
think I
that
debated
slip
Mike
up.
Roos. I think you think
Oh,
Uh,
Michael Shermer is who I debated. I don't think I debated Michael Roos ever.
okay.
oh, okay.
We had Michael Ruse on
Aaron
our
Ra.
show. We
Sorry
had
about
Michael
that.
Ruse on
Aaron.
our live stream one time. He's a hoot, actually. But yes, go ahead about
But
Aaron Ra.
but he debated Aaron Ra, and I mean, spiritually speaking, he beat him to a pulp. And I mean, I was beginning to start feeling sorry for him, but then again, I was like, nah, he deserved it. And he don't have any facts to back up his claims. I mean, at least atheists has got, most atheists has got facts or untrue facts, but they got some false analogy to back up what they're saying. But he doesn't have any. So I am very excited. We've been trying to work on getting Michael Jones on for, I guess, around a year or so. But glad to have him. But let's start out getting to know him. What would you like to ask, Scott?
Well, yeah. Why did you call your channel Inspiring Philosophy? Are you trained as a philosopher? I actually don't know your
So
background.
I got my master's in philosophy a few years ago.
Hmm.
When I started the channel, I didn't though. I did want to do philosophy stuff, so I was trying to think of names, and I tried a couple things. I don't remember what they were, but they were already taken
Hmm.
back in like 2011 of YouTube. So like, back then you had to basically pick a username, uh, and you couldn't change it. So this is like early YouTube. So I was trying different things like the aspiring philosopher, and something like that, and then eventually inspiring philosophy worked. So just kind of trial and error, I guess.
Right, right. So, since we're talking about atheism today, I was wondering what your background was like growing up, faith-wise. Was it a Christian household, believing, non-believing, what?
Yeah, it was like a pretty fundamentalist believing household. I kind of became a deist in high school and eventually became a Christian later. But I kind of I don't really agree with a lot of my fundamentalist upbringings, some of the mentalities there. I just kind of like restructured. I don't want to say deconstructed. I kind of restructured my Christian beliefs. Went through a period of deism, basically.
Yeah. I grew up in an unbelieving household, at least. My father was an agnostic, I would say, even I like the term apatheist, apathy towards all religions. Don't care, don't know, don't care. Not hostile, but I pretty much just became a kind of atheist by default. Again, not hostile, not a militant atheist, just thought it's all mythology. And I think a lot of that had to do with the way I was brought up, but also the school system. It pretty much trains you
Hmm.
in secularism to think in that way.
Yeah.
Jody, though, grew up in a in a fundamental household, I'd say. That's probably Jody. How would you characterize it?
I would consider, yeah, fundamentalist household. We believed in the Bible. We believed the Bible was inspired, and I never had the concept of atheism, but I did go through a period of being at least a quite agnostic. Where I questioned my faith. I was still praying. I was still going to church, but I did question whether God existed, and I looked for the evidence of God's existence. And I think through the Bible and through creation, through different aspects, historical evidence, things like that, I became a Christian again.
So this brings me back to you, Michael. In terms of your Christianity and that reconstruction you mentioned, and philosophy, did the philosophy help you reconstruct your
Yeah.
Christianity, or what was that like?
Well, yeah, I think, it's like, I think it's Francis Bacon that said this, like a little philosophy leads to atheism, but
Right.
more when you drink the whole glass, you'll wind up at theism or something of that nature. I mean, that's kind of how it was. I think when I got to things like cosmological arguments or moral arguments, I definitely was like, okay, there's got to be some type of God. I mean, again, I was never really an atheist. I was a deist for a little while. But then becoming a Christian, I just tried to actually study Christianity, treat it like I always say this, I try to treat it like any other ancient book. Okay, I'm not going to be super skeptical. I'm not going to assume it's inspired. Let's just see where the evidence lands. And so, judging the evidence for the resurrection, using philosophy to judge the resurrection, what is going to be the most likely explanation, positing the least amount of assumptions, led me to the idea that it's most likely Jesus did rise from the dead. And the Gospels are reliable accounts. I think a lot of the criticisms against like the Gospels, I was never impressed by because you just take this extra level of skepticism that just you wouldn't apply to any other ancient work. And so when I saw more of the critical scholars doing that, I was just convinced that they're not really being honest with the evidence, because when you look at the evidence, I think you come away with the idea the Gospels are reliable.
All right. So before we jump into the new atheism, I think I'd like to just kind of discuss the history of philosophers who have promoted some kind of atheism. I think we could even find some ancient Greeks who would have something we would today call a kind of atheistic view. Although Socrates, part of the reason Socrates was executed was for not giving worship to the gods, or that was the accusation. I can't remember the exact crime, but it was a
Mm.
failure to promote the gods of the city. And I do remember reading his apology. I don't know if you've read Plato's Apology of Socrates, the Apologia, but Socrates basically does say, it was the God that I spoke to, the Oracle of Delphi, that sent me here. I thought this guy's not an atheist by our standards. Anyway, what thoughts do you have about the history of philosophical atheism?
Yeah, I mean, you do see some hints of it in some of the early classical works. Not like it would be today, though, for sure. I mean, you could look at like Epicurus, for example. But I mean, like he would, he's more like a crypto atheist. I mean, he rejects like the idea there's like a supreme creator to some degree. You also have Justin Martyr, for example, talking about various philosophers that were atheists. He's asking the Romans, why are you persecuting us? You call us atheists because we don't worship the Roman gods, but you don't persecute these philosophers who you also call atheists. What's the deal? So you have some early thinkers that rejected the belief that there were gods. Some believed that there may have been gods, but there wasn't like a supreme creator. So nothing really like what we would have today, because as Tom Holland says, modern atheism really comes out of the Christian tradition. You wouldn't get the modern atheist movement if you didn't get Christianity first. So you got to have first the scientific method developed, which comes out of the Christian tradition. Science has to develop better understanding of the natural world, and then you get an offshoot of that. You get the modern atheist that we have today. So it's really not fair to say that the philosophers of the ancient world were atheists like the ones we have today. They're a different breed altogether.
Yeah, I'm so glad you mentioned Tom Holland. That story is one of my favorite to look at as, in terms of what happened with new atheism, than what we have today. Not so much new atheism, but we have, Jordan Peterson, who may not be a believer, but he's very open and friendly to faith traditions. You have Tom Holland, the historian, again, not a believer like we are, but saying, I'm a Christian. So
Hmm.
this is why we came up with this idea, and whatever happened to the new atheism. And I had seen some articles, some videos, the rise and fall of the new atheism. And I think we're at that
Hmm.
point now, after the fall of new atheism, that we can look back and analyze it. Okay, so again, in terms of history, we have that, the Greeks who, and the Christians who were called atheists, but weren't really atheists. But in the Enlightenment, I think we really started to see true atheists, and oddly, some who are Christians are considered founders of this kind of Enlightenment atheism. People like Descartes, because of the Cartesian split, the idea of fact values split, the mind matter split. Comes out of Descartes, and that gives steam to the Enlightenment type of atheism. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so that's kind of where they're drawing from these enlightened ideas that came about, and it just sort of comes from a very simplistic understanding that the more we know about the world, the less we need of God. So why posit a God? As if God was always sort of filling in gaps in our knowledge in the past, and it's really not the way it was. But this is sort of how it comes about. And of course, there is more sophisticated atheists today that don't take that view, but that's generally kind of how the intellectual stream is sort of moving. Like, some have said like Darwin was a huge step. We don't need God to
Mhm.
explain life anymore, or how life comes about. And so you kind of have that sort of slow moving away, thinking that, well, the more we know about the universe, the less we need to posit God.
Jody, any questions?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the more I know about the universe, like his statement, the more I have to believe in God because of the fine tuning argument. Because I think it just is overwhelming evidence that they, maybe not the Christian God, but definitely had to be an intelligent life form or intelligence higher than our own outside the universe that had to have, intelligence to do all these fine tuning things. I mean, we won't get into that today, but there's tons of fine tuning arguments that you can use to prove that there's a divine creator.
Yeah, actually, when we
Hmm.
get to the philosophical discussion, that would be something to talk about. But okay, so after the Renaissance or the Enlightenment, we had this period where there was some growth of atheism, but it never really achieved a kind of popularity here in the United States, especially just before the new atheists became popular. It seems like atheism was present. There was always some there, but it was never popular, and people didn't trust atheists. We still, when you take polls, find that people don't trust atheists. They don't want them as politicians. But when the new atheism broke onto the scene, and shortly after 9/11, in the next few years, these several books came out. We had the four horsemen of the new atheism: Dawkins, Hitchens, Dennett, and Harris. Let me put those up on the screen. These four achieved this notoriety that I think was never before seen in the popular culture. They became kind of rock stars, and it was quite an amazing phenomenon to watch, especially now as we look back on the rise and fall of the new atheism. Um, what do we want to say about the popularity of this? What was it? If only 9/11 and the fear of Islamic Jihad, what brought this to the fore, do you think, Michael?
Yeah, it's a good question. I wouldn't say it's one thing. It's probably going to be multiple variables. I mean, for one thing, we do see in sociology that if countries become more wealthy, religiosity declines because people tend to revert to religious ideas when they feel like they need God. So, poverty, disease, famine, people tend to turn to religion. When you have less of that, people tend to not be religious because their lives are comfortable. Why do they need God? And it's a very selfish human tendency, but that tends to be the way we tend to react in a lot of ways. So this is why we see religiosity flourish in more impoverished regions, and we see people with live in more wealthy regions like Vermont or California to be less religious. It just tends to be the way humans generally move. So that's going to be one reason. I think another reason is people started to associate religiosity with oppression. So people started to think like you had this 90s culture that sort of produced this idea of rebellion from norms. Same within the 80s too, the rebellion from norms, rebellion from the establishment, these kinds of things. And people looked at, well, what's established? Well, Christianity is very much established in our culture. We should rebel from that. That's holding us back. And this tends to come out of a lot of leftist ideological thinkings, which is on the left, you get a lot of people who think like, okay, they have a kind of a utopian vision of how humanity should work. You saw this in like, early thinkers like Marx, as well as like Foucault, to some degree as well. Basically, it's this idea of, look, we humans have the capacity to make the world perfect if we wanted to. Why isn't the world perfect? Well, it's because we've established certain institutions that hold us back. We need to get rid of those institutions and restructure society so that we can really bring humanity into an age of utopia. This is sort of what you saw with the Jacobin Revolution in France. They were starting over with year zero. Okay, the wisdom of the past didn't work. We need to start over, restructure everything without religion, other institutions, and we will make society into some sort of utopia because we will really, it's these institutions that are corrupting humanity. And of course, Edmund Burke laughed at them, and he was right too. You had, of course, the USSR that said they were going to build a new man. They thought humans were born as blank slates. You could really just make humans into whatever you wanted. So that tends to be a very leftist thinking. So a lot of times throughout history, and we see these cycles, I think we saw another one recently with the rise of new atheism, was it just this reoccurring cycle that keeps coming up. All right, society isn't perfect. Civilization isn't perfect. Why not? We could make it perfect. It's not that hard. Surely it's not something inherent in human nature, because they tend to reject ideas like original sin. And so they go, well, we need to get rid of established institutions, religion. So new atheism rises. Religion is holding us back. It's preventing us from entering an age of reason and enlightenment and intellectual, which is lead the way. Same fallacy a lot of movements of the past had. And of course, it just simply didn't work. And it won't work because the problem is human nature. The reason why we don't live in a utopia is because human nature is, out of, as Immanuel Kant said, out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing was ever made. And if you tend to be more on the leftist side of things, you don't look at humanity like that. You look at humanity as being straight timber, but institutions start to make it crooked as it grows. And if you just remove the institutions, the timber of humanity will grow straight up. So that tends to be, I think, some of the reasons as to why we saw the rise of new atheism in this cycle.
Yeah, that's great. One thing you mentioned there about how the wealthy, you have to have a wealthy, comfortable situation before you start seeing this kind of atheism and rejection of God. Jesus said the same thing, how difficult for the wealthy to enter the kingdom of God. When you become comfortable, your faith always starts to wane. And we see it here today in the West because we're so wealthy, we're so well off here in the West. This is where faith goes down. But in the poorer countries, lots of Christian growth of the Christian church in the, what do they call it? The global South. And when you mentioned the poor, it's easier for the poor people. This was one thing that surprised me when I went to work in a food pantry back in Texas, meeting people who were coming to get food. I never hardly met an atheist. I think I met one atheist the whole time. The people who were coming to get food, the people who were not well off, they were religious. Not all of them Christian, but many of them Christian, and it was actually wonderful. So that's great analysis. The other thing you were saying was about how they wanted, or this idea had cropped up at the time, that if we get rid of the establishment, the things that are the institutions that were popularly, you mentioned the French Revolution. I always laugh at this line that they had: "We must strangle the last king with the guts of the last priest." So they want to tear down the monarchy and tear down the church. Um, that was those two pillars of the establishment. So yes,
Yeah.
and that happened here in the United States in the 60s. And as you were saying, I'm thinking that is a Marxist idea. And then you mentioned Marx. But when I look at the new atheists, they themselves were not Marxist or promoting Marxist kind of philosophy, as far as I can tell. But I think what you're saying is like the soil was ready to take root for this new atheism. So what would you say? What is the kind of philosophy of new atheism? What was the driving force, if not Marxism? What would you
Yeah,
think?
it wasn't Marxism. I'm just saying there's different cycles where we have these different cycles that keep coming up where some youngsters think that they can fix society just by making everything better. And the way they do it is they change the institutions, and that's manifest in various ways. Like Marxism was a big one, the Jacobins was a big one, that kind of stuff. So the philosophy of new atheism was not only that religion is wrong, it's that respect for religion is also wrong. That, religion holds us back. It creates a lot of the problems of the world. I mean, this was one of the subjects of Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. Like everything that was bad in the world, he just tried to tie to religion, and everything that was good in the world was tied to rejecting religion. So he like tried to even tie Stalin to like religious thinking. But then Martin Luther King Jr. and his good ideas, well, that's not religion, that's just humanism. Like it was a totally like unfalsifiable claim, because anything, he just basically assumed his conclusion, anything good is therefore coming from not something that's rejecting religion, and everything bad is coming from religion. It was a stupid book. I mean, let's just be honest, it's a stupid book. So that's kind of what was going on. And so they thought, like, if they could just get rid of religion, get rid of respect for religion, we start hating religion, we'll enter this age of enlightenment where we'll be guided by reason and science, and we won't have to be held back by old superstitions. And so that was generally what they thought would happen. And of course, that's just not the way it worked. They had the same underlying assumptions that these earlier cycles had, which is that humans are born as blank slates. We're corrupted by something. In their view, it was religion. Religion corrupts people. It makes us dogmatic. It makes us superstitious. It makes us prejudiced. It makes us hateful. And if we just get rid of religion, like, we'll be born, then we can just be guided by reason and science and just empathy for one another. I mean, there's a Family Guy clip where people are sitting around in the ancient world going, I like you, and then someone runs in and says, hey, a guy was just born to some virgin in Bethlehem, and then everyone just starts stabbing each other. What's the implication? Everyone was lovely and peaceful until religion came along and ruined everything. That's generally the way the new atheists thought. And of course, that's such an unscientific position to hold to, because like so much sociological research shows how beneficial religion is for self-control, lower levels of aggression, more empathy, better mental health. So like they thought they were being scientific, and they were just making one of the most unscientific positions out there.
Yeah, what you just said reminds me of Tom Holland's experience. This myth had grown up that the Greco-Roman culture was the foundation of Western civilization. It's where we got all our morals and values and principles from. And let me just put this up. It's skipping a little bit ahead, but Tom Holland, in New Statesman, he came out with this article, Why I Was Wrong About Christianity. And if anyone doesn't recognize Tom Holland, he's a historian. There he is. This is another article on Patheos blog, where the last line of that article in New Statesman, he said this, or one of the lines, I began to realize that actually in almost every way I am Christian. In his study of the Greco-Roman culture that our modern myth tells us is the foundation of all our morals and ethics and society and all the wonderful things, he saw that was not actually true at all. The Romans that were cruel, they were oppressive to women, they enslaved lots of people. So were the Greeks, perhaps a little bit less, but the Romans and the Greeks together were not. And in his study of late antiquity, the birth of Christianity and triumph of Christianity is where he discovered all the morals and ethics that he himself had embraced as a modern Westerner. So that I think you've got a great point there, that back in the New Atheism day, this idea that Greece and Rome was the founding of our society, that less religious. But by the way, if you actually go study Rome, they were incredibly religious. I think, the only reason we think the Romans weren't religious is because of guys like, who wrote The Rise and Fall of Roman Empires? His name is escaping me right now. He secularized, I think, Rome. And so the historians had this idea that Rome is a secular place. Not at all. Anyway, if you want to comment on that.
Well, I mean, if atheists like to say, if you were born in the Middle East, you'd just be a Muslim. If you were born in India, you'd just be a Hindu. And I like to reply, yeah, well, if you were born 2,000 years ago, you would think slavery was okay. You'd be an avid racist because you would just call everyone a barbarian. You would think it's okay to leave infants out in the wilderness if parents didn't want them. In fact, you'd be okay with killing infants, because the way we identify brothels from the ancient world is the amount of infant graves we find there, because they didn't believe the intellect was in like an infant. So prostitute would have a kid, they'd kill the kid so the prostitute could get back to work. So that's how we identify brothels of the ancient world. You'd think that women are second-class citizens and they don't have the same rationality as men do. You'd think young boys should be used for sex. What changed all that? Christianity. Like John Martins writes that Christians had to invent new words to describe how evil the Romans were in their sexual perversions, for example. Christians started orphanages. They go around, they round up these poor kids being left out to die and bring them to orphanages. I mean, obviously our orphanages are not ideal, but it's better than them dying. I mean, so it's like that kind of stuff, for example. So, I mean, people don't realize when they criticize Christianity for being I'll see atheists make videos like the Bible's pro-slavery. I'm like, the Bible? The Bible's the reason you hate slavery today. Like, everyone thought slavery was the norm in the ancient world. What happened? Well, some Christians, not all, but some said, no, this is anti-Christian. We need to get rid of slavery. And they fought feverishly to end slavery and made it the norm today that slavery is wrong. I mean, Robert Fogel, for example, is an historian, writes that the British Empire in the 1700s went from promoting slavery to the middle of the 1800s actively setting aside funds to end the slave trade, to hunt down French and American slavers and hang them. And so then they sent missionaries into Central Africa to end slavery there as well. So like what ended slavery? It was Christianity. They'll try to say, well, we know Christians were promoting slavery at times. Yes, because that was the cultural norm of humanity for thousands of years prior to that. What caused the change? Well, it happened within Christianity. It was the central tenets of the Christian faith, which led to people saying, you know what, I actually don't think this is compatible with God's law, his revealed revelation. And so Christians that were promoting slavery were just going along with a human custom. They even appealed to tradition at times. They appealed to this has been a long-standing human custom for generations. And the abolitionists appealed to what the New Testament actually taught. So I find it funny that people think Rome or Athens is the foundation of Western civilization. I mean, they contribute, but the central pillar is Jerusalem, really.
Amen.
Well, I find that when I'm reading about the Roman history, little, like you mentioned earlier, little boys with sex objects, little girls with sex objects. You had your wife, then you possibly, if you was gay, you had your boyfriend, then you had your little kid on the side, and then you had your mistress. I mean, it was perversion. So, Christianity came around and changed all of that. I'm glad you mentioned that, because without Christianity, we would probably still be in slavery and all this other stuff. I mean, Islam promotes slavery and human trafficking and sex slaves. But Christianity promotes do unto others as you would have them to do unto you.
And just a note on that, I mean, they'll try to say, well, the golden rule existed before Christianity. Well, no, it didn't. What existed was a negative form of it. So don't do to others what you don't want done to you. I mean, you could fulfill that just sitting in a cave doing nothing. But the golden rule in Christianity is do unto others as you want done to you. So you actually have to go out and do it. So that's a good important point people don't realize about the ancient golden rule.
Yeah, and another thing I would point out to people like that is even the Old Testament in the Torah, we find love your neighbor as yourself. That is not something Jesus invented in the first century AD. It goes all the way back to the 15th century BC, which is also the time of the Exodus when God, the greatest emancipator of all history, brought his nation out of slavery. And that is the earliest, I think, abolitionist tome is the book of Exodus. So how can you say the Bible promotes slavery? In a way, I think the new atheists did us a favor by exposing some of these things so that they could be the truth behind it could come out. Now that it's been brought to the fore, something like Tom Holland digging deeper has found the truth. By the way, Edward Gibbon is the one I was trying to think of. He's the one who wrote History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. Here's the Wikipedia page. He hated
Oh
Christianity
God.
is the feeling that I get. I haven't actually read this history, but I think
Well,
he
the book's
warped a lot of
horrible.
it.
He accuses the Christian. Yeah, he accuses the Christians of burning down the Library of Alexandria, a
Mhm.
modern myth many still believe today, and it's just utter nonsense. That never happened.
Yeah, so Gibbon, I think, contributed a lot of that to that soil in which the new atheism grew up and took root. But in a way, they've done us a favor by exposing all this and allowing the truth to come out. I think it's becoming more available that people are seeing. Oh yeah, the Romans were cruel. There was lots of slavery. Oh, I'm reminded at this point about slavery in Stark's book. The sociologist Rodney Stark, he mentioned, I'd never heard this one before from secular history. In the 10th century, Christendom, that is Western Europe, they had eliminated slavery. In some places, it was outlawed. It was pretty much mostly gone. It was not all gone, but mostly gone from just this one area. Why? Because of
Mhm.
Christianity. So, unfortunately, back in the 15th century AD, it comes back. It comes back in the West and then has to be abolished all over again in the 18th and 19th century. So, but at least that impetus from the scripture from Christianity is what puts slavery to an end twice already. Hopefully, even more. But I want to go to something else. As wonderful as the Christian faith has been, there is something to religious zealotry that is scary. We do see Islamic jihad leading to death and destruction. We see, the word Christian nationalism, I think it's been tossed around too much, but we do see some violence occasionally committed in the name of God, Christianity, the Crusades. There is some ugly features of the Christian history that you can point to, that the new atheists can point to give ammunition to their argument. So what do we have to say about those? What would you say, Michael?
Well, if we look at things like Christian nationalism, this is one of the big ironies here, is that it's not something that comes about from religiosity. It comes about from declining religiosity. So we define Christian nationalism as the idea that the government should actively promote Christianity and that Christianity should be in the business of protecting national identities and national borders, national or various ethnicities. This idea actually comes about when people stop going to church. So there was a study done a few years ago. They called this Stroop et al. I think it was 2021. They basically pointed out that there was no evidence of church-based mobilization for Christian nationalism. In fact, Christian nationalism was manifesting among the least churched individuals. So the more likely you go to church, the less likely you are to be a Christian nationalist. And so, like, this is something that Philip Gorski said. Loose from its religious moorings, Christian nationalism flows free from its ethical tether in the direction of secular messianism. And his basic point is that when people on the right deconvert, they keep their Christian symbols and they just reinterpret them in political ways. So they just get reinterpreted into political means. When we see this with people like Nick Fuentes, for example, or various different political pundits now, they sound very Christian, but they're very political, and they just talk about Christian symbols as political weapons. And so it's one of those big ironies is that atheists are deconverting Christians, and then the right isn't going away because people that are on the right just stay on the right and they just reinterpret Christianity into their political ideas. So, if you want less nationalism, less authoritarianism, you should be promoting more Christianity.
Yeah, I like that. These excesses come in, these violent movements, when you cease to be in the scriptures, cease to be following the teachings of Christ, who is obviously teaching peace and not violence. I don't know how you go in the other direction, but okay. Well, at this point, I think I'd like to transition to talk about the fall of the new atheism, and I think there's several different things that played into this. Oh, let's start with Christopher Hitchens because he's dead. He's gone. But before he died, he struck up a friendship with Larry Taunton, Fixed Point Foundation. And Larry is a Christian apologist, a good thinker himself. And the two of them went on several road trips, or they went on 2 road trips, but they spent a lot of time together talking about faith. And Larry tells us in his book that Christopher never converted, but he was considering it. He was learning about religion when he had one foot in the grave. He's got esophageal cancer. He's got a death sentence hanging over his head. All of a sudden, atheism doesn't quite do the trick. Here's the New York Times headline: Christopher Hitchens was shaky in his atheism, new book suggests, and that's Larry's book. Larry's book here is The Faith of Christopher Hitchens, and he says that Hitch was open to listening to those things. So I thought that was interesting because it sort of demonstrates that atheism is not really livable when it comes to these serious life matters, like what happens or what will prepare you for death, what will give hope, what will give light and life to the world and the culture. It's easy when you're in an academic ivory tower to say Christianity bad, all religion bad, but when you are faced with your own personal crisis, all of a sudden he's open to talk. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, well, new atheism was essentially riddled with problems. For one thing, it wasn't really like a complete ideology. What I mean by that is it was essentially just someone running around with a hammer. There's a problem with Islam. There's a problem with Christianity. There's a problem with Hinduism. There's a problem with Judaism. And when your entire movement is based on hate and anger, you don't really offer people anything that is sustainable, because people can be angry for a certain time, but then they get tired and they want to settle down and they want to have something they can hold on to that's firm. And a lot of what new atheists do today is they don't really even establish that. They just go around attacking and poking holes in Christianity. Okay, but think of it like this. If I got a boat that can get you to the other side of the river, and someone comes along and says, yeah, but there's a hole in the boat, and that one, that one piece of wood looks a little deteriorated there. And I said, well, okay, sure, it's not perfect, but it will get us to the other side of the river. What do you have? And all he has is a hammer. No one's going to get in his boat. That's the problem with new atheism. It's not a boat, it's a hammer. And all it can do is it can attack other boats, but it can't actually get you anywhere. It can't actually establish anything. It's not a house you could build on. And this is what it essentially was. And so, I mean, like, when you're doing that, you're not really establishing anything. Their idea of establishment is a society of faith, of reason and science. Okay, well, science and reason can happen in many ideologies. What's special about yours? You could be a Christian and be a scientist. You can be a Christian and be reasonable. So explain to me why I should be in your movement, not otherwise. The other aspect is it doesn't really offer anything to the human condition. Christianity offers something to the human condition. You're a sinner. You're not perfect. Everyone acknowledges you're not perfect. Okay, that's because of original sin. That's because of your sin. But Jesus makes you whole. Come to Christianity, you will be made whole. You'll be given a purpose. The creator of the universe became human to die for you and to know you. I mean, quite frankly, just tell the poorest of the poor, people that live in Africa and have to live off trash, tell them that they're a collection of cells and they're probably going to die in a few decades. So just live for now, live the best life you can. It'll all be good. Yeah, they're digging through trash. Or tell them that the creator of the universe died for them so they can be royalty and rule over the universe with God one day. Which one do you think is going to give them more hope, purpose, and meaning? See, new atheism sounds really good to an educated liberal Westerner who has a nice house and a nice bank account, because he can live for hedonism. He can live for the here and now. The poor can't. So it's essentially an ideology that thrives among rich, angry people, not among poor people who need something that they can actually build a firm foundation on. And so eventually it's just going to wither away because it doesn't replace Christianity with values and ideological factors that are necessary for what people actually need.
Well, it's like the thief on the cross. I mean, he was hanging there with Jesus. I mean, he had lost all hope, but through Jesus Christ, he received hope. And then Jesus said, "Today you will be with me in paradise." So, we're all dying. We're not going to be here that long. So Jesus gives me the hope of eternal life. And I know I'm going to receive eternal life. I'm going to receive a better life. And this life is, not as good as it's going to be in the next life. So Jesus gives me everything. What does atheism offer me? Nothing.
Yeah, and especially hope. Hope is something everybody needs. It's like oxygen. We need hope to be alive, and their brand of new atheism didn't offer that. And besides, not only was it not unified, it was seemingly even fractured, divided against itself, as Jesus said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand." There were accusations of chauvinism, sexism seemed to be one of the features of the new atheism. It was not stable from the get-go. But let's move on to the next one. I was going to say the friendship between Christopher Hitchens and Larry Taunton reminds me of the friendship between Antony Flew, the most famous atheist of the 20th century, and Gary Habermas, who they had struck up a friendship also. And by the time, just before he died, Flew was saying there is a God. He's basically a deist, not what we would call a Christian believer. So even back then, atheism had holes in it. But moving along, let's talk about Sam Harris, I guess is the next one on my list. Sam Harris was also one of the four horsemen of the new atheism, and perhaps not as belligerent as Hitchens or Dawkins. But lately, Sam has his podcast. He seems to be into a kind of Buddhism, call it secular Buddhism or something like that, which involves meditation, mindfulness, and all these things that are spirituality without religion, as his book is called. So it's not like Sam is completely hostile to religion. And I like this one headline I saw: "Sam Harris, Buddhism doesn't want you either." The Buddhists are not entirely excited to call Sam Harris one of their own, but it is something that is, he's not like completely hostile to all things spirituality. That's hardly makes you a diehard militant atheist anymore, Sam. What do you think?
Well, I mean, I think this just speaks to the fact that, just new atheism is just incomplete as a worldview. I mean, people start to look for purpose and meaning elsewhere because you just can't run around with a hammer all day. You eventually want something for yourself, something that you can build a foundation on and a worldview on. And atheism just doesn't offer anything. And man is naturally a religious animal. We can be atheists for a time, but it just isn't sustainable for generation upon generation. I mean, people don't realize this, but religion is the reason we have civilization. That's just a fact. Like if you go back to the ancient hunter-gatherer societies, how did they go from hunter-gatherers to building cities? They built cities around temples, around ziggurats, or religious aspects. They desired the aspect of the sacred so much, they just started to develop entire cities around sacred spaces, temples, for example. So, like, religion was a major factor into what caused civilization to eventually come about. So, it's because humans, as we are, desires something religious. And now that may not be theism, but even like, for example, if you study secular people in like Denmark or Sweden, a lot of them still believe in like souls, or they'll talk about purpose and meaning. So like they'll use religious language. So like I remember reading an interview one time where some girl who was a bona fide atheist in Britain, was being asked like about life decisions, and she's in, they asked her like, why did you not go to college, or why did you drop out of college at this point? And she said, so I could learn X, Y, and Z. Well, hold on, that you're implying there's some sort of like purpose to your life or certain things. This is all supposed to be random chance. Like, what are the practical reasons you did X, Y, and Z? Like you're talking about like purpose and meaning and fate and these kinds of things, and that's religious language. Now you may not say, well, that's not traditional religion. Okay, yeah, but it's still religious in some aspect, and religion is very, very hard to define by actual experts. Like William Cavanaugh talks about this in his book, The Myth of Religious Violence. One of the chapters, he points out, like, we don't even know what religion is. Like, Confucianism is more similar to like Platonism, than it is to like Christianity. But Confucianism is considered a religion, whereas Platonism isn't. Like, weird. So like, it's like one of those things. Like there are many ways to be religious, and a lot of the ways that a lot of the secular people talk about sounds like Eastern religiosity just as a Western form. So I just think that's one of the problems with new atheism.
Yeah, this reminds me, I wrote a paper in a seminary about the demarcation problem of trying to define religion. You can't really define religion. But I love what you were saying about the European secularism always reverts to religious language because, as you say, we're a sacred animal. We always fall back onto that in describing what's coming up, our hope. Why do we continue? Teleology is always driving us forward. And I've recently, we've seen the rise of the nuns here in the US. Atheism, this is another thing that I was amazed to discover. Atheism is about 3% of the population. It's roughly fixed. It doesn't vary up and down very much. It's not growing. It's not shrinking. We always have the atheists with us. But the nuns have increased quite a bit. People, N-O-N-E-S, nuns, people who say, I don't have a religion, none of the above. I don't go to church, except a lot of the nuns do go to church. When you actually look at the polling data, many of the nuns pray. Some of them pray. Many of the nuns read a scripture of some kind or other, or are interested in these things. So the nuns are not completely without religiosity of some kind. And I think this is reflected when we see the new atheists, like Sam Harris, always, here he is invoking something, mindfulness, meditation, to connect with the transcendent. However, it's understood, right? And this is why the definition of religion is so difficult. People have some idea of what's beyond us, what's transcendent, what's coming in the future, and they want to connect with that. That's my idea of spirituality or religion. So, and we're seeing that even in the American secularists. All right, next big story that I really thought, this one really tickled me when Ayaan Hirsi Ali became a Christian, because she was that Enlightenment thinker. She was always saying the Enlightenment rationality, this is why I reject Islam and religion generally. But then she herself had a crisis, and a life crisis. So just like Hitchens having to face his own death, found that atheism couldn't give him hope and reason to live in life, Ayaan said she herself despaired of life. And someone asked and suggested to her, why don't you pray to God? She did, and she became a Christian. And of course, this upset Richard Dawkins so much that he created an open letter to Ayaan, which I read at one time. I swear I read it on the net, but I couldn't find it. I just found this video where he discusses his open letter. He was basically saying, Ayaan, you're not a Christian any more than I am. But then they got together for the God debate, and that video is also on YouTube. You can watch the two of them. By the end of the debate, the discussion, Richard is saying, I see that you really are an atheist or a Christian, a believer. And I thought he was very upset about this, of course, because he's losing this person who's clearly a rational thinker, clearly an Enlightenment type thinker, and yet she couldn't also live without faith and hope and beauty and life and light that comes from the Christian gospel. I love that story.
Well,
Yeah,
I
think.
I wouldn't find it
Go ahead.
impossible for Richard Dawkins to become a Christian one day. The Apostle Paul became a Christian. Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think that just speaks to like the problem with new atheism. It's not a sustainable position. It doesn't offer people the hope and purpose and meaning that they need. So again, you can be angry for a while, but when you calm down, you're going to go, okay, what do I have? New atheism is really built on anger and hate for religion. That's not sustainable long term. People are starting to realize that now. So you see a lot of people that are hateful online, but I mean, you can only do that for so long. And again, that's not generational too. Another one of the problems of new atheism is just or atheism and secularism in general is just the low birth rates. We know that when society secularized, their birth rates dwindle like drastically to the point of like you start to go like, are you guys gonna even be around in a couple generations? Like Korea's like birth rate is like 1.1. In various secular countries, it's below replacement level too. It's close to one. Uh, that's not secularism is so bad for humanity because it literally just removes humanity like generational over time. So I mean, like, it's not atheism, secularism has never been sustainable just from looking at the birth rates alone.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to say a new atheism ate its young. It's one of those things that is so inherently flawed that it destroys itself. You don't even have
Mm-hmm.
to tear it down from the outside. It's gonna collapse. All right, so last topic then was to talk about the philosophical foundations of new atheism, if there are any such foundations. I I once attended a lecture by Gary Habermas, and I thought this was a good point he made. Atheism is not a worldview. As you said, you have a hammer to destroy everything, the new atheism at least. It's not a here's how we build up. Here's a foundation on which you can build. It is here's how you tear down. It's a negative view, a denial of other worldviews, as James Sire said in his book, the Basic Worldview Catalog, The Universe Next Door. I love that book. Atheism isn't really a worldview, but there are some things that can be considered worldviews: naturalism, materialism, atomism, absurdism, nihilism. These can be considered atheist worldviews, but none of those, I don't think, have a good foundation either. What's your thoughts about atheism as a worldview or ideology?
Yeah, well, it's not a worldview. It's just basically saying God doesn't exist. I mean, again, it's just incomplete. And so when a lot of people become atheists, that becomes their whole identity. I mean, not all the time, but often what you see with the promoters of it. And they don't really offer a complete worldview. It's lacking in a lot of ways. So I mean, like, this is why atheism just tends to be a minority position throughout human history and probably will be. People will say, well, there's a rise of like the nuns. I mean, well, most nuns are religious in some way. They would be classified as like quest religiosity. They're not nuns in the sense that they lack all religious thinking. They're nuns in the sense that they don't hold to some sort of organized religion. But I know Christians that like they're progressive Christians and they would be considered nuns, even though they still call themselves progressive Christians. Atheists would not welcome them into their club. So we need to keep that in mind. And so I just think atheism itself is just always going to be a minority position just because of human nature.
Well, to
Oh,
me,
okay.
it's always going to be a minority because it's not logical, it's not practical, it's not reasonable. They attack, but they never say this is the reason you should believe. So I think atheism is just not logical.
Yeah, and this, now you had brought this up before, Jody, about the fine-tuning argument, that the teleology that we see. I think this is something that atheism can't explain. Even those worldviews like naturalism and the others I mentioned don't seem to be able to explain the reality that we live in. Where did it all come from? Why does it have so much information, a low entropy state? And why is it running down? If where does why does it have this teleology? Where's the information come from? This is something I've not heard a good philosophical foundation for naturalism, for example. We have a book called Philosophical Foundations of a Christian Worldview. I've never seen the corresponding atheist foundation. I've always been looking at that for something like naturalism. Michael, have you ever seen a book like that or a
Yeah,
take on it?
Graham Oppy's got some good books to argue for more naturalistic outlook. I would say start with him. I mean, so you do have that. You do have strong philosophical cases for naturalism. What I would say though is that even though one could make that, I would push back because I think there's some good arguments against it. But what I'm talking more about is the condition of humanity and what humanity naturally is. We just tend to be religious in nature, and we tend to think religious. Now, you could say that's just an offshoot of our evolutionary history, but we could also say it's consistent with a theistic worldview. God is going to make us in a way that we would fundamentally want to seek him and already think in terms of language and have thoughts that are already in line with a religious worldview, because theism is true. So you can make that case easily. I just tend to don't think naturalism can really solve humanity and what humanity needs. It's an intellectual position. You'll see it in academia. You'll see it among elites. You're not going to find it among the poorest of the poor. Rarely will that occur.
Right. And I think those examples that we were looking at with the fall of New Atheism demonstrate that when it's about living out your life, when you're dealing with esophageal cancer and you have a death sentence, atheism doesn't connect with you, doesn't give you hope for the future. Ion her life was not enlightened by atheism so much that she could deal with this crisis that she was going through, the depression, the suicidal thoughts. Atheism couldn't give her hope in that time. And that was,
yeah, well, I mean, you also got to think, I mean, for most people, a secular or an atheist outlook is not going to offer them anything other than hedonism. Now, again, the elites can have purpose and meaning in directing society, influencing society, controlling society. But what does the gas station worker or the person working at a factory mill or the farmer gain out of this? They don't really have a lot of purpose. They're just a day laborer. Hedonism, watch your porn, play your video games, eat your snacks. That's what life is about. And we see this in current society now. We see the rise of a lot of people. That's all they claim they live for, and they're depressed and miserable. They don't have a real purpose. They don't have real connections. We see the rise of incels, for example. Well, I mean, 20, 30 years ago, people went to church. Their life revolved around a church community, going to church every Sunday, a weekly Bible study. They had a community. They had a way to interact with people, develop social skills. They had intellectual growth because they'd study and debate the Bible. They had ways to meet people of the opposite gender and form relationships and then build families. When you took that away, the new atheists did, what was left? Nothing, because society was built around religion, as it has been for millennia. I mean, again, go back to the ancient world. They built cities around temples for a reason. Take the temple away, why do they stay in the city? Well, they wouldn't. And that's an important point that I think a lot of the new atheists overlooked in their attempt to be rational. They weren't. They were acting on emotion, anger, and they weren't thinking about this stuff long term or about how human psychology really works.
Right. Atheism doesn't connect with the human condition. But I do want to go back to that we use a cosmological argument sometimes to argue with atheists, or someone might. The idea of the origin of the universe, the reason it takes the shape it does, I don't think that there can be a good naturalistic explanation that covers all those details. Even the Big Bang seems to be insufficient to explain what about the information, the ordering, why the low entropy state. But I think sometimes what happens with the secularists is they actually want to connect with the transcended. Since religion has been taken away, they look at the universe. I think of Carl Sagan. His awe for the universe was like a religious awe. He wanted to be connected with the transcendent and not having God in his life. He just looked at that and said this statement, which I think is ridiculous: the universe is all that is or ever was or ever will be. Even on Big Bang Theory, it's not all it ever was. There was a time when it came into being. How can you make such a statement? It just feels like a kind of replacement religion to put the universe in its place, and yet their origin story doesn't live up to that. A good explanation. What have you heard one?
Well, I mean, no, and a lot of them say they don't need one. You also have to remember the Big Bang came from a Catholic priest, George
Mhm.
Lemaitre's, and when it first came out, atheists rejected it. They mocked it because they wanted an eternal universe model. So they held to things like the steady state model. But I mean, a lot of atheists don't think they need that kind of thing. They just want to be agnostic about that, and I don't think that really works for the majority of what people need in terms of their psychology.
Mm. You don't need it until life comes at you hard with with
Hmm.
cancer and or depression. Then you need it. All right, I got a
Well, I
question
mean,
from.
I
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, I would just say that's just what again, it's lacking a full view of human psychology. It's built on anger and hate for religion, and they just run around. And when you forget the humans have other emotions and other states of life, you're gonna think new atheism can solve everything, and it just simply can't. And then when you start to experience those other emotions, other states of life, you realize how inadequate it is.
Yeah. All right. I want to take a question from the YouTube chat. We have our friend RJ. He says, "What do you think would be the best way to evangelize or carry out the Great Commission? Apologetics and debate, street preaching, etc."
Well, it depends on where you are. I mean, there's going to be various ways to carry out the Great Commission. You can't reduce it to just one thing because we're a body and a body works in different ways. The foot is not going to do the same thing as that the hand is doing. So sometimes it's serving, sometimes it's preaching, sometimes it's apologetics, sometimes it's engaging in debates. You got to just uh, adjust to the culture. As Paul said, I, like those under the law, I become like those under the law, like those, like to win those outside of the law, I become like those outside of the law. So you got to like think of it like that. Who are the people you're trying to reach? What's the best way to reach them?
Yeah, I like what you went to the tech teaching that the body has many members. We are one body, but there are many members. And I think a lot of people think, oh, well, shouldn't I be out there like standing on the street corner evangelizing? Well, there's a member of the body who's doing that. Maybe you could support them in some way. And maybe that's not your gifting or your calling. God gives gifts according to partly because our abilities or the grace that he has for each one. I would say play to your strengths, try and determine what it is you've been called to and equipped for, and do that because there's other members of the body doing other things. And some people won't be doing direct evangelism, but in indirect support of people who are doing evangelism. When Jody and I went to New York, we went to Palmyra to witness to the Mormons during their pageant. We were put up by a wonderful Christian couple. They allowed us to stay in their home, and they had the gift of hospitality. They put up several of us missionaries who were there, and they were wonderful support. They gave us a place to stay. They made meals for us, and I don't see any difference between the work that they're doing for the kingdom and the work we're doing for the kingdom in God's eyes, as if, well, evangelists are going to get better rewards because they stood on the corner and shouted at people. Everybody is doing their part, right? So just
Hmm.
know your calling, know your equipping, and all that. But since we're talking about new atheism, uh, Michael, any particular advice about atheists? What have you, did you get to talk to Aaron Ra behind the scenes? What do you say
Yeah.
to someone like that?
Well, I mean, we didn't really talk about religion before the debate. That was what the debate was going to be about. So we didn't really talk about it. And when you seeing the kind of person that he is, well, he's what am I going to say? Trying to debate with him is just going to make him more stubborn and more confrontational. That's
Mhm.
not the way to witness to someone like that. He's not open to hearing it right now. So you just be friendly to them and pray for them. You got to engage each person where they are. Some people are open right now. Some people are not. Like the Pharisees were not open to Jesus's preaching, so he didn't actively try to seek them. So he just publicly shamed them in hopes that other people who were open would see it and hear his message. So you got to keep it in mind in terms of who you're dealing with too, as well.
Jody, you got any questions?
Well, I just think about, what you should do. Like you mentioned, the people that helped us, let us stay there, they did not go with us. They did not, you know, go out and actively engage the Mormons, but they did something so important. They gave us a place to stay. They gave us food to eat. And without that, we would have been a lot less people out there evangelizing, because some of us literally couldn't afford to do the mission without them. So, like you mentioned earlier, there's many members, and not everybody does the same thing. We obviously need more prayer warriors. I mean, we got to pray, and the God of this world have blinded the minds of them which believe not. And we have to go into the world and preach the gospel, but not every one of us actually goes to street preaching. Not every one of us has got a YouTube channel. Some of us is behind the scenes. Some of us does this, that, and the other. Just make sure you're doing something. There was a critic of ours criticizing the way we were witnessing to the Mormons. Well, we said, we love what we're doing better than what you are not doing. They wasn't doing anything to witness to the Mormons. So it's better to do something than nothing. Just ask God, pray and ask God what he would have you to do.
Yeah, when we talk about evangelizing atheists, I think one of the things that just emerges from this discussion we just had is it's not the intellectual appeal so much, but the appeal to the heart, to the life. How are you going to live this out? To hope, to, the human condition, right? I think too much of our atheism or our apologetics towards atheism is geared to the head and not the heart. But I'm so pleased, Michael, in talking to you, who's trained in philosophy, that you kept going back to this, problems with the human condition. And what we saw today is we need to speak to the heart of those people and ask them, how do you live this out? When I first started studying apologetics, I didn't recognize until later on down the line how cold and sterile and academic it was. And when I did, I kind of felt like something's missing here. I can't use just this intellectual thing to evangelize. When I look in the scripture, when I see the gospels, what Jesus did and said, when I see the evangelists and how they went out and preached and connected with people, it wasn't all in the head level. There was that human connection. There was relationship, and the talk of how we relate to God through relationships, and what is humanity defined by a relationship made in the image of God. That is all about the human condition and much less about the philosophy. Yeah, we can see Paul giving philosophical sermons and making such arguments, but never losing the heart part. So that would be my advice to the RJ and anybody else was considering that question. So, Michael, what have you been working on your channel, or do you have a website? What else are you working on lately? What's new?
Yeah, I'm currently working on a series on the reliability of the Gospels. About 4 more parts of it, maybe 4 or 5 more parts coming out. So the next video in that series will be Luke and eyewitness account, and then John and eyewitness account. I already have the ones on Matthew and Mark out, and some other videos as well. So I'm going to keep working on that. And next summer I'll be doing a series on like all the good Christianity has done, like ended slavery, spread literacy, created science, protected children, all sorts of different topics, created human rights. So a lot of stuff coming out on that kind of area.
Right. So for your reliability of the Bible, are you going with history, archaeology, logic? What is the main thrust of it? When you mentioned Luke, I thought of Colin Hemmer's work about all the historical facts and evidences that we see when we look at the book of Luke. So many details about names and places and even the currents that was carrying the ship that Paul was riding on in Luke Acts. All these things line up with what we can verify now with scientific evidence that they couldn't then. What is the thrust of your evidence for the reliability of the scripture?
Well, I'm not doing reliability of the Bible. I'm doing reliability of the Gospels. I'm just focusing on the Gospels. Okay. And there's various internal factors that we use, correlations with history, reasons to trust them, external evidence as well, showing that, there was unanimous consent among church fathers that the Gospel authors are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So whole different aspects of internal evidence, comparing it with the culture, these kinds of things.
That's great. So I'll just make a quick plug for our channel. If you go to the Disciples of Yahweh in Christ, one of my recent video series was on the Olivet Discourse, 12 videos to get through the entire discourse. That's a passage that is highly misunderstood by a lot of people, but I'll take you through and show you how to read it in context, where it comes from, the Old Testament passages that are invoked in this. There's a lot of Old Testament depth in that, and I really am proud of that series. It went well. So if you guys who are watching haven't seen that series, check that out, and check out Michael's series on the reliability of the Gospels. That's a very important thing, and that would be good for your atheist friends.
Hmm.
All right. Oh, someone here says I'm a former atheist. Oh yeah, RJ. Yeah, we know RJ's the story. Well, I'm a former atheist too. Um, so this is near and dear to my heart, and I'm always interested in why people believe or don't believe, fascinated with, the various different ways to believe. One of the first things I did after becoming a Christian was to start studying world religions. I read Kingdom of the Cults, Walter Martin's book, cover to cover. It's like 800 pages. It's enormous, but I was so fascinated with, why is it that I didn't believe? My atheism was so shallow. I'd never thought through any of these issues, the kind that we talk about here. I think if somebody had come up to me and just started asking the right questions, my atheism would have collapsed. Yeah.
Yeah.
So great to meet another atheist. All right. Well, if there's nothing else, I guess we can just wrap it up here and say thank you, Michael, so much for coming out and being on our channel and sharing your thoughts. Really appreciate your depth of knowledge and study.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
All right.
Jody?
And if you get tired of being an atheist or an agnostic, I got an option for you. Why don't you try Christianity? And if it's not for you after, let's say, 6 months, go back to your atheism. But try Christianity. And I believe if you sincerely try Christianity, if you try Jesus Christ, if you try to look at the Bible to see if it's true, if you try scientifically, you can prove the Bible scientifically. You can prove the Bible with historical accuracy. You can prove the Bible. You can prove Jesus Christ existed, because even Bart Ehrman, an atheist agnostic, even admits that Jesus Christ lived. He believed that Jesus was alive. He believed Jesus died on the cross. And he also believed the disciples believed that he rose from the dead. So I challenge you to check Christianity out, and you will find out that Jesus Christ is the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And remember to subscribe to our channel. If you got any ideas for other YouTube videos, let us know. Email us if you got any questions. If you want to come to faith, email us. Just email us with any comments. God bless, and I appreciate y'all joining us today.
All right.
And
Thanks, everybody.
subscribe to our channel, Disciples of YHWH in Christ. Bye.
Thanks, Michael. Thanks, everyone who's watching and commented. God bless. Bye-bye. All right. We are off the air.